Stante förtroende them.
Thank you so much. We'll now go into team introductions. OG.
Sorry. Hi, sorry, I'm going first, no preference.
Yo, my name is Ted. I'm speaking second. I prefer the he series pronouns, please.
Thank you so much, opening government. Opening up.
Marta will be speaking first. Joseph will be speaking second.
All right, thank you so much. Closing gov.
Speaking first is Matt, he or they. Speaking second is Ahmed, no preference.
All right, and finally, closing opposition.
Hi, Roman speaking first, Alex speaking second. We have no preference, thank you.
All right, thank you so much, everyone, for the introductions. We'll now move into a couple of announcements before we start the round. All right, the first announcement is with regards to time. So I'm a bit lazy. I won't be putting timestamps in the chat. So please keep your own time. I'll have a timer with me. So if you go above 7 minutes and 15, I'll just use my hands. If speakers want to ask POIs, just keep a timer with you too, so that you know when to ask POIs. You don't ask POIs during protected time. So that's really it about the timing thing. The second is with regards to POIs. Please take them. We like them as judges. We enjoy them. And also they're encouraged for engagement. The second thing here is that please state your preference before your speech. Do you want it in the chat? Do you want it verbally? Speakers, please respect the preference given by whoever is on the floor. If they say the chat, keep it in the chat. If they do agree to verbal press, then well and good. On the verbal POI bit, if this does allow verbal press, don't badger them. Space out your POIs like 30, 40 seconds between each other so that you're not constantly interrupting the speaker and constantly interrupting the judges from hearing what the speaker is saying. So space out your POIs and no badgering. And then when the speaker on the floor allows you to ask a POI, this is to those who are receiving POIs, let the speaker ask their POI. Don't cut them off like 10 seconds, 15 seconds to ask their POIs so that we can also hear the POI. And speakers, don't abuse that power. Don't load like 6 questions in one sentence. Just ask one short, concise POI in a way that, you know, the rules allow you to. Other than that, I do think that we're good to go. So I'll just check with org if the streaming is ready and if we are ready to go. All right, just a sec. Okay, I think we're good to go. Prime Minister, the floor is yours. Here.
Hi, am I clearly audible?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, awesome. Happy to be here and also happy to take POIs. So if you have a point, don't type it in the chat because I won't read the chat, so I won't know the point of information. So just unmute and then be like point and then I'll take it. So I'll take at least one from more from opening opposition, hopefully. Okay. All right. Starting my speech in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, go. And everything is a mental illness, nothing is. We think that this delegitimizes the way people perceive illnesses and harms the most vulnerable. 2 things in my speech. First of all, why is it likely to harm people in a way that specifically, why does this delegitimize people who do have illnesses? Why does this make poor people not seek help? Why does this make rich people clog up the system? And why is it likely to destroy everyday level impacts? Second, societal level impacts. The entire academic field of psychology takes a huge hit in legitimacy and reduces the amount of funding and trust that people have in it in the first place. First, note why reasons. First, those who go through these issues and know that they have an actual illness are often on a spectrum. Some people have extremely serious problems. Some people have weaker levels of frustration and struggle in their life. And often, when you're just upset quite a bit, it's not really an illness. For example, you don't get depression every time a family member dies, but often it can make you upset for many months at a time. At that point, there are things that are emotions that are not actually illnesses in the first place. What happens to people with mental illnesses when people who are, say, frustrated about the cleanliness of their room say that they have OCD? 3 things. First, people have less empathy for them. And this is the reason why. people think that they have an explanation and understanding of what this mental illness feels like. They think that they know what depression feels like because they themselves have felt some parts of depression, because they just said, I am depressed. I was sad at a certain time. They don't recognize the difference between that and depression. They think that their boyfriend, who was kind of an asshole to them, is a toxic relationship, and they don't think that the other person has anything that's significantly higher than them. Hence, they're less likely to accept the fact that this person has suffered much more than they can imagine, and hence have much less empathy and bandwidth to deal with their issues. This means less discussions, less care for this person, less concern about their issues in the first place. But second, they think they understand it already. They think they know how to solve it. This is your parents thinking that because you are feeling sad and you think you have depression, actually, it was when they were young and they were also upset, and it's not a mental illness. It's just you not being hardworking enough and you have a solution to this. The difference is at the point you start using these terms in your everyday life, people who are currently liberalizing start to think that because they are feeling similar experiences, they also understand this. The second reason is often that this spreads into everyday vernacular and starts looking normal to people, which reduces the urgency to attach to these terms in the first place. Often, this means that you think that the urgency of someone having depression, or the urgency of something being toxic, is not as high because you've seen it used so often. It's diffused so common vocabulary. Is racist, it becomes very difficult to determine who actually is. The same thing happens now, and we don't have a signaling mechanism for finding the people who are most in need. But third, before that, closing opposition quickly.
So there is a premise that you don't analyze. Why does people saying this will lead to negative outcomes to people who have actual problems in their head? Because presumably they can opt out, not care, and they can just continue with their lives.
Of course they can't opt out. I just told you it's an everyday life, but people around them are saying your family doesn't take you seriously anymore, often because they think, oh, this is what OCD is. For like 4 to 5 years, I've seen many people say they're OCD. Now my son is saying it as well. Well, it's just a normal thing. It's not a real illness. And people who already have it feel constantly frustrated because here's the shit thing I told you, right? Other people don't give a shit about them anymore because they think that they are similar to them. At the point where you think you have experienced what they have, it's difficult to have the emotional bandwidth to listen to them and hear them out and the issues that they have. That means you are less likely to have special privileges to the person who genuinely needs it because they cannot focus. Because ADHD means they cannot actually write notes properly, and you just think that means you not being able to listen to like your homework podcast or something because you're watching Netflix. The third reason is this lowers the barrier of entry for expertise and reduces the need for experts. You don't trust psychologists to the point where you think you have an understanding in the first place. The difference is on our side, often because these are seen as highly medical terms, people don't say, I have a fever. The second they're feeling slightly upset, oh no, I have hypothermia. When they hear those words, they think, I need an expert to understand these words. I need an expert to solve these problems. At the point where this becomes everyday parlance, you think that you have the barrier to entry to solve these issues and understand them. But fourth of all, it increases the stigma to even speak out about this. And this is where I go into my analysis of what this affects in terms of people going into the system. There's nuance here. Some people are often poor and cannot afford to go to the system and have stigma against it. Some people are often richer. They have the luxury to afford to go to the system. How do these two groups respond to this? People who cannot afford this often will respond by justifying the fact that they do not have an illness because of this stigma uniquely, because there is no urgency anymore. The alarm bells don't ring. This is important. This is unique for 3 reasons. First, because they do not have the money, so they need to justify the fact they are taking the right decision, which they often know that might not be the best one. So I can't afford it. I might as well justify it in one way or the other. Second, it's because the stigma that they faced in the past, where someone who has a mental illness is weaker and not strong. But third, it's because of their framework and mindset. So the social narratives they have actually frame the way they view the world. So new information they get tends to make them believe that actually I don't really have a mental illness. Why do we break this on our side for poorer people? It's because it looks like a terrifying death knell. It looks like something you have to solve right now. It is something that is a genuine threat of your actual life. This is why often poor people who think that, say, something like a fever or a cold, which is normal, is something that they can avoid and not go to the doctor for. But if someone says you have a risk of hypothermia, it kicks in and they say, okay, this is the point where I go to a doctor. This is the point where I seek medication. We take away that side from opposition when everyone thinks it's the same normal thing people are saying, and this delegitimizes the urgency. Before that, quickly opening opposition.
In the decades before this popularization, people stigmatized mental health as well. Where's your...
No, because if you stigmatize mental health, then this can't exist in the first place. This narrative exists on both sides when a mental health starts becoming the thing that people care about. Notably, you can only talk about things like toxic and OCD and depression when you know that they exist, and you only know that they exist at the point where people are talking about it in a serious way anyway. Also, there's many other incentives for this to increase. For example, like just people recognizing that it actually makes their lives worse, and just the illness is becoming more popular, the field growing in general. You can't just take that out of history. Okay, finally, why does this destroy everyday relationships and harm the actual legitimacy of academia? Okay, on relationships, it harms relationships because it delegitimizes the fear of things like toxic relationships. First, because the people who are in them start to doubt themselves. They think, am I just another person who's often likely to like randomly call someone toxic and cut them off? And the person that I'm dating is likely to say things like, oh, don't call me toxic, I'm terrified of this. And that means that often you start to think of yourself as the villain when you see someone as an evil person, because it's such a large accusation. It's much more easy to say things like, I'm angry at you or frustrated with you, which means you're more likely to overcorrect. But secondly, people don't take you seriously when you speak out because it looks like every other person calling each other toxic, at which point it's hard to once again signal the urgency of relationships that are toxic, which means the people who are in the worst relationships are likely to stay there with no one talking to them. Finally, the impacts of this on the academic field are that you do not respect psychologists anymore because they do things like make public diagnoses of individuals, which you think is just irrelevant, and often push things like systems that over-medicalize problems that are everyday issues. Ted will expand on the academia stuff.
All right, we thank the Prime Minister for that speech. We welcome the Leader of Opposition to start the opening opposition case. Here.
Hello, I will assume I'm audible.
Yes,
and not Kindle. That's just like a bad joke. Okay, I'm gonna start my speech. I'm just checking if everything is fine. Okay, I'm gonna start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, I have a confession to make. In the status quo, people often call me as someone who does have ADHD, as someone who often actually involves in like over-compulsive behavior. However, what the alternative is how they portrayed me in high school. Then they called me weird, lost, and aloof. And I think that this is basically something that both govs need to deal with. We will always have an incentive to label specific behaviors which are outside of what we perceive as normal. And I do believe that the burden on gov is to point out why any alternative labeling will be far better. What we are going to claim is this is far better than any alternative. It actively raises the awareness of how many people are suffering from this, and it actually helps people like realize that they do have some of these behaviors, right? Let's first start with framing, right? First of all, how is this used today, right? Because I do believe that opening gov is very vague on this, right? Notice that even when we use today the terms like OCD and ADHD very often, we still acknowledge that there is a scale of how much people are suffering from all these conditions, right? We do not, even in the status quo, we do not think, or I do believe that like a bunch of people actually do not agree with this, that everyone who suffers from OCD suffers to the same extent, right? Notice that today, at the moment, we have huge amount of mental health awareness. I don't think we ever in history had such huge levels of like mental health awareness, meaning to some people, meaning to some extent that people do acknowledge that there is a scale between how much I suffer from ADHD, probably very mild, versus someone who basically is struggling with this for their whole life. So there is a scale, and opening government is wrong when they say that we perceive everyone who is having ADHD the same. I think this is just like very poor nuance, and majority of people today do have a more nuanced view on this, right? Second of all, what happens if this is not the popular terms that we use, right? First of all, we use it only in most extreme cases, right? You use ADHD only when you see that someone is like truly suffering from this, right? Second of all, you use other types of hyperboles to explain some of the behaviors which are outside of the norm, right? Very often you will call people who have ADHD as not focused, as weird, as aloof, people who do gaslighting, like we'll call them as bad or evil, right? Or just as weirdos, right? These types of labelings will exist anyway, and I'm going to explain what's the harm of them later in my speech. Third point in framing, and then I promise I'm going to get into arguments, right? How we actually explain what these terms means, right? And I do believe there's two levels on this, right? First of all, when we say that someone has ADHD, we acknowledge that there is a psychological explanation behind their behavior. We also do this when we call someone a gaslighter, right? We don't think this is something which is inherent to them, right? We think that very often their DNA, their chemistry, very often stuff which happened in their life made them this way. We don't perceive these behaviors as something which is inherent to them, right? And I do believe the alternative is you will label them in a way which points out that these traits are inherent to them, right? Meaning you generally have just less understanding for what they are doing, right? I think on our side of the house, at least, for whatever we treat people do, you give a psychological explanation which makes it easy and possible to correct, right? You actually give people other chance when you say that they have ADHD and not that they are just like lazy and lack focus, right? I think secondly, right, when this is more common, people perceive it as more normal, right? If we label a bunch of people as having ADHD, we are now starting to perceive ADHD as something which is quite common in our society, right? That means to some extent that we have less re-stigmatize those that do have it, and B, we're actually likely to support like researching and funding and investing in like solving ADHD far more, because now we actually acknowledge that this is an issue which everyone faces with on the side of the gov, right? When we believe this is just like a small group of people and basically the treatment should be reserved only for the most extreme cases, right? We lower the incentive of the general public to get informed on this, right? To support funding of this, to generally like research this less, right? And I do believe this is the role the govs have to stand in. With all this being said, what are the harms of this policy? First harm, as I already said, this actually stigmatizes people who do have ADHD and who basically would suffer anyway, right? So notice that a bunch of times people who have, so if your alternative is, you will only portray people who are very extreme cases of ADHD, right? What this will actually lead to is, first of all, I do believe that you're just like going to be less likely to employ and to give chances to people that do have these conditions. But B, right, there is going to be less need for research funding, as I already said, right? Notice that on our side of the house, right, when you basically acknowledge it, like there is a group of people who are somewhere in the middle, right? There's a bunch of people that have like ADHD or like OCD are not the most extreme ones. Bunch of them are actually in the middle. When you basically acknowledge this and you say that this is quite common, you lower the risk that very often employers feel when they basically need to give chances to these people, right? Like very often increase the level of understanding that people have, because now they don't see this as something which is an outlier. This is now a common thing, something which bunch of us have. Second harm of this, right? You will use far worse derogatory language to describe behaviors which are outside of norm. As I already said, we already need to label types of behaviors because we're humans and sometimes we're just bad, right? We just need to give explanation to stuff which we do not understand. The alternative is you call people that have ADHD not focus. You call people who very often have OCD as creeps, right? This is bad because, first of all, it lowers the amount of empathy for them in general, right? Because now you describe that these traits are inherent to them, right? But second of all, people that do have ADHD or like people who gaslight, right, have harder time accepting that they are doing this, right? Because to some extent, you're now not giving a medical explanation of what happened to them. You're giving an explanation which says you are inherently this way. Something is broken with you, right? The alternative is you tell them, right, this is a medical behavior which can be corrected. There is basically a way for you to fix this, right? This is not something which is inherent to you. I would not take CG.
This is deeply internally inconsistent. If it is the case, as you concede, there is a broad trend toward destigmatization in the status quo on either side due to increased awareness, why on earth is the likely narrative?
No. Exactly. Destigmatization happened because we started using these terms more popularly, right? Exactly because now we're using these terms far more. This is one of the reasons which are driving the stigma fucking down, right? I don't think it is I don't think the destigmatization happened prior to it. What are then the benefits of this? First of all, you have more knowledge about mental health in general, right? Exactly because people are using these terms more. You have many more articles which are basically explaining the terms, right? People engage in discussions about what the fuck does gaslighting even mean? Like very often this is a point in like popular TV shows, in popular music, right? It is good because first of all, people have more nuanced understanding of how these conditions actively work, right? The alternative is you only show them the most extreme examples, which are very often unnuanced, right? People have less understanding of this, and there is less of a need in popular public and in popular media to talk about it, right? Second of all, right, I do believe now you're more likely to recognize some of these conditions in yourself, right? Because as I said, a bunch of the people are actually in the middle of these conditions, right? And if you portray only the most extreme versions, they're not likely to see that and to acknowledge the issue that they have, right? Because they don't perceive it as something which is similar to it, right? I do believe that at the end of the day, it's raised the amount of knowledge that we have on these conditions, right? Second of all, the alternative is far worse. And third of all, we actually increase the understanding and funding for a bunch of these conditions. Please don't be for side, which will call me aloof. At least let them call me as someone who has ADHD. Very proud to oppose.
All right, we thank the leader of OP for that speech. We now welcome the Deputy Prime Minister to proceed with the OG case. Here.
All right, can everyone see and hear me?
Yep.
All right, give me 1 second. So for POIs, just put them in the chat. I'll probably take closing opposition at around the 5:30 or 5:40 minute mark. Give me 1 second to drink and then I'll start. Cool. All right. I'm gonna start in 3. Wait, sorry, my chat's not up. Cool. All right, it's up now. All right. I'm gonna start in 3, 2, 1. Let me respond to OO first. Number 1, and I think this goes with closing opposition as well, why you cannot opt out of this. The first thing I want to point out is if individuals who are mentally ill are able to opt out of this narrative on either side, it significantly undercuts all of the benefit opening opposition want to go for, because it means simultaneously you're unable to get a lot of the social narrative benefit. And this is important because oftentimes when it comes to mental illnesses, it is not just about the internal calculus you have, but the external support that happens, which does not happen on their side of the house if people do not perceive it as urgent, which is the counterfactual Sharia gives you. If people perceive your condition to be serious and urgent, you're more likely going to get support, which is a counterfactual they're never able to get on their side of the house. But second, Sharia gave you a lot of structural reasons as to why you probably cannot opt out, because it is literally everywhere. It becomes ingrained in the socio-cultural vernacular because of the rise of digitization and the likely manifestation of how this narrative works, which also beats a lot of opening opposition, because Marta and Yossi literally just asserts that people are smart and can see nuance. Here are a lot of reasons why that's unlikely. Number 1, the manifestation of this is likely through things like memes, for example, or through things like little snippets on social media because of the way in which individuals communicate nowadays. You are literally unable to communicate nuance with a 150 character tweet or through a 6-second video on TikTok. But number 2, like, people are actually pretty much assholes who are really busy and care about their own life. So insofar as that was the case, it was unclear as to why people have an incentive to read up on that nuance, but oftentimes on both sides of the house, as opening opposition correctly identifies, there's very little educational capital that goes into teaching individuals about whether or not mental illnesses exist and the extent of that nuance. But 3, even if you do know about it, you have an incentive to fit into the social in-group. So if the overwhelming narrative says everyone should use toxic as a joke, as it is done in debate, for example, when whips do things that gaslight their opening teams, then people internalize to think that's how they ought to behave, and that social norm ends up overriding any of the nuances that opening opposition wants to go for. Second response to opening opposition: why is it there's still an incentive for individuals to read up on medical illnesses? And this is important because insofar as this was the case, a lot of the benefit on individuals being called weird is probably out. The first thing I want to point out is I think there's symmetric incentives, but if anything, the incentives actually exist better on our side of the house for individuals to go to the doctor. 1, you do not want to see your family members suffering. 2, oftentimes big pharma and medical professionals have been incented to advertise the seriousness of that issue. The delta, and this response to all POI to Sharia, is that it is less likely that you get that on their side of the house. 1, because you trivialize mental illnesses, so it's seen as less important. But 2, there's a clogging of the industry because rich individuals who now preemptively think they have ADHD because their friends use it as a joke are more likely going to go, which means it's far harder for individuals on the ground to access it. So on both sides of the house, people in the most urgent instances have an incentive to go. You make it far more inaccessible on their side of the house. The leader of opposition response to this is like, no, but this is good because if you're not called as someone with ADHD, then you're going to be called weird or quirky. Here are 3 responses to this. Number 1, I'm genuinely unsure why being called weird or quirky is a bad thing. Like, as a kid, I was called that a lot, and it was quite moralizing because I was able to think I was different. I was able to think that I was unique. But second response, and this is important, it is easier for these disenfranchised youths to reclaim and empower themselves with that word, because the issue on their side is everyone is called ADHD. So if you're seen as that weird kid, you're unable to be different. You're unable to shine and be who you want to be. On our side, you're able to find other people who are called weird and band together. You do not have that capacity on their side because rich elitist youths who are really, really mean are necessarily going to call you out. But 3, the issue here, and I think this is quite important, is if on their side of the house, the default is you insult people using ADHD, it kind of overlaps in a way that makes it far harder to solve systemic issues. Because if you call lazy people as someone with ADHD, for example, then you now default to thinking if you're lazy, you have ADHD. All lazy people have ADHD. So it's far harder to get to the core of the issue. On our side, it is far easier because you only tell individuals who you think as having those issues to be the ones that is likely going to be the case. Final response here, and this is quite important. I just don't know why if a kid is called weird, you're not going to go like look at their symptoms and then figure out they have that mental illness. If anything, it is better on our side of the house because these are the only individuals that are going to be doing it. And therefore, you do not clog up the mental system. Is there's a perception that you're never able to change. Let me weigh Shario's material now. No, thank you, Ruben. Number 1, Shario proves why you delegitimize medical institutions and you trivialize the beats all of off bench, even if Seal has a banger extension in this debate. Number 1, what this means is even if they can prove that there's more medical funding or more social impetus, the issue is people are preemptively told not to go in the first place because it is seen as unimportant for the very simple reason Sharia proves, which is that parents are going to dismiss it. Because oftentimes it is seen as super expensive. It is seen as trivial. And it becomes a joke to the extent in which the framing I gave you at the top is true. This is logically prior to all of op-bench's harms. Because even if op-bench can prove that the medical industry is better, if people just choose not to go, you are not a magician. You cannot make them go. So people are less able to get help. On our side, it's seen as urgent, and therefore you're able to go and get help. But 2, this is also important on our side of the house, for the reason that the framing of urgency means you have more targeted help towards individuals that need it. The comparative was that you're likely going to clog up medical institutions in a way that was bad. Third piece of weighing, and this is important. On our side of the house, on their side of the house, you create a perception of redundancy in the academia of the institution because you think if it's the case that everyone knows about ADHD in the best case of opening opposition, why then do we need to invest in medical institutions or individuals who do that research? Sharia mechanizes this quite well, but there's 3 additional reasons. Why? 1, you no longer respect medical institutions if you think the average individual can do it because there's a lower barrier of entry. 2, oftentimes there's significantly less cost. So you're more likely going to default into your friends, for example, as compared to experts, which is bad because experts oftentimes are accountable. Experts have technocracy. Experts are people you're able to literally point to. Your friends are fairly flaky and sometimes they might give you really shitty advice. But 3, it is also far harder than for you to access the medical professionals because of structural barriers that oftentimes exist. You're now disincentivized to do so. Before I weigh why this is important, closing up.
The one thing that I don't understand about the second argument is that if these people are so important, if therapists are so nice, why isn't there symmetric incentives to go and fund these people?
No, because it is seen as trivial, and the issue is it's super expensive on your side. It's not as expensive. I'm going to explain that later. The reason why this piece of weighing is important as well is because if we're able to prove that there's a perception of redundancy, what ends up happening is A, you're less likely going to get more therapists going into the field, so it further clogs up the system that Sharia talks about. But 2, you also get less new treatment, which is important because oftentimes discourse at the top trickles down into better treatment to help individuals. There's a cap at how much effectiveness the current treatment can have. So more treatment, more diverse treatment in the future is exponentially more important. But finally, this is important because even if you don't buy any of this, Sharia proves the interpersonal relationship argument, which is at best certain in this debate. The outcomes on the medical industry and the social norms is fairly speculative. So you weigh this certainty above all else. Finally then, what does Sharia tell you about the way in which funding works? 1, Sharia proves why rich individuals clog up the system more, which is bad for 2 reasons. A, you deprioritize the vulnerable people OO says is important. But 2, over time, this also drives up the prices of going to therapy, which responds to the COPOI because it makes it more inaccessible for individuals. But C, it makes it so that there's less social capital to fund it because if the perception is you don't need the state because your boyfriend can just diagnose you, then there's less ability to coalesce funding to help individuals or to galvanize individuals to make policies to help individuals with mental illnesses. So the most vulnerable individuals on their side systemically lose out. That's why OG has to win this debate. Propose.
All right, we thank the Deputy Prime Minister for that speech. We welcome the Deputy Leader of Opposition to conclude the opening half and the opening opposition case. Here.
I'll just assume based on Marta's speech that I am also in fact audible. I will be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, it's very rare that studying medicine and working in a psychiatric clinic has advantages, but in this particular debate, it happens to, yes, have those advantages. I'm going to explain in my speech why it is necessary to understand what other people are going through in order to have to free up the resources to help them and make help for them accessible, because you need to empathize with their standpoint in order to be willing to help them out. Before I get into this line of argumentation, a lot of rebuttal to opening government. The first thing we hear is when everyone has ADHD, then no one has it. Panel, that's like saying if everyone has COVID, then no one has it, because a lot of people have mild symptoms and then no one takes the serious symptoms seriously. It's just unclear to me why people lack the mental capacity to understand that that health conditions exist on a spectrum, exist on a scale, and that some people are hit harder and some people are hit more softly. It is significantly harder for people to empathize with something that is fundamentally outside of their ability to understand and comprehend. Most people, yes, have suffered a little bit of depression, but if they don't understand that what they went through was in fact depression, then they might only understand someone actually being given sick leave for being depressed as, they're just a little sad, I don't understand, as opposed to having the necessary understanding of, dealing with it. We hear a few things, however, from open government. We hear this idea that, because you don't have an incentive to invest in the system if it's just trivial. Untrue. If more people access the system, you actually and think this is something that is necessary to be treated, you have a greater incentive for states to actually fund the system in the first place. It is unclear to me why when something becomes a bigger issue in society, we spend less money on it. This is just an assertion from opening government. Then they tell us, but now it's a stigma when you have a severe case. Look, at best for opening government, the stigma is symmetrical, because if no one understands it, then you're just, as Marta has explained to you, considered crazy or weird, or, at worst, you might even be just considered psychopathic. These are the worst instances of why people are actually in status quo afraid of going to psychiatrists and psychologists, and have historically felt, because it is so heavily stigmatized in society and has been. Now that the discourse is increasing in society and people actually have an incentive to educate themselves because it is becoming part of the colloquial use of language, so you have a greater incentive for media to educate people on what gaslighting means, on what toxicity means, you actually have a higher likelihood of people being educated on these issues and being able to empathize with them. Then we hear this idea that, the entire field of psychology is somehow delegitimized because reasons. First of all, in status quo, people have also delegitimized that, as I already pointed out. Secondly, no, it probably doesn't. It's actually significantly more likely that it is actually legitimized on our side of the house, because people can empathize with mental health issues on a level that they otherwise cannot. And Marta has already explained why that's how people interact with it. Finally, we hear this idea, finally, let's take them at an even higher level. Let's assume the field of psychology does take a little bit of harm. We still think that's worth it if on our side there's, generally speaking, more empathy for people with mental health issues on our side of the house. And this is where I get into the constructive of my case, because it's really important for you to understand why empathizing with another person's standpoint is necessary as a precondition for you helping them. Let's start first with the important bit. Ted is correct that people are, generally speaking, busy of thinking of their own lives. I fully agree with that. We generally have a tendency to consider things from our perspective, from our standpoint. Mental health, by its very nature, is, generally speaking, invisible to people in the overwhelming number of cases, because it is something that we suffer from quietly, right? The fact that I have severe ADHD to the fact that I'm considered severely disabled by the state of Germany, immediately obvious when someone looks at me. That is the invisible nature of mental health issues. That means that mental health issues, while simultaneously mental health issues can represent a significant detriment to interacting in society. This can be things like requiring additional assistance, sick leave because you're going through a depressive phase, right? In previous decades, we often had to go to colleagues in the medical field and ask them to give sick notes for other conditions, because people were so afraid of being labeled as being, crazy, that they would actively seek help outside of it, because they were afraid there would be a lack of understanding. Where does this the question then is, where are people actually more likely to offer us the kind of help that we need on our side of the debate? It is just ultimately, it comes ultimately from people having empathy. How do you gain empathy? OG claims you will have empathy because everyone has these conditions, therefore it is considered as just normal. But this is structurally untrue, because the underlying mechanism to be able to actually empathize with other people is that you need to understand what is going on with them. Check your intuition panel. If you walk and look on the staircase Probably in most cases, most people will just see access to a building, entrance to a building. However, someone who rocks up in a wheelchair is probably going to see inherently a lack of access to the building because their personal perception of what that looks like is something that inherently excludes them. Most people are able to consider what it feels like to not be able to walk. Because many of us have either hurt our legs, broken our bones, sometimes we're in states where we were unable to walk, and therefore can easily empathize with this highly visible lack of access. But the kind of access that is being deprived of us in mental health issues, which is not visible, is not as easily accessible, and therefore needs to be highlighted, and is more easily highlighted by having popularized the colloquial use in our general language. Before I continue, closing.
This is not a regrets debate. Do you truly believe that all of the things like rising rates of autism, doctors trying to make mental health care more accessible, and increasing medical knowledge and understanding conditions aren't far more significant contributing factors to the degree
something is generally speaking only in an academic field and is structurally inaccessible to the average person, then presumably yes. For example, when feminists talk about, when feminists or racial scholars talk about things like white supremacy, but these haven't yet made it into the general colloquial language of people, then oftentimes what you actually do is create significant amounts of backlash against these types of education in terms of wanting to spend additional funding. In fact, when people who generally don't have the time or the education or the money or the access to actually or the incentive to learn about these terms, it is significantly less likely that this popularizes. It is unclear to me why even if doctors and medical health professionals have the incentive to popularize it, why the media would listen to this, why the average person would listen to this, etc. However, when every person you interact with, your friends, your parents, your teachers, everyone uses this language, it is something that you fundamentally are significantly more likely to understand, meaning that on the comparative, in terms of where understanding is greater, that is squarely on our side. Because understanding is the necessary prerequisite in order for people to actually access and to understand why people need to have help, and how to be given help, and what help looks like, and why you are entitled and deserve that help. This debate falls squarely on side opposition, incredibly proud to oppose.
All right, we thank the leader of OP for that speech. We've now come to the end of the opening half. We welcome the member of Gov to start the closing half and the CG keys. Here.
Great. Can people confirm I'm clearly audible?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Great. Starting in 3, 2, 1. The problem with both top half teams is they do not understand the nuance of the human experience when you are struggling. Crucially, people have a vast array of different conditions, whether they are mental health conditions or not, just suffering from gaslighting. People respond to suffering differently, and different people need to hear different advice from different people at different times. What Therapy Speak uniquely does is homogenizes and collectivizes lots of different struggles under specific umbrella terms that fail to reflect the nuances of people suffering, and trades off directly against seeking medical help for the most vulnerable people, i.e. the people who are sick. First point of framing. I do not think in the absence of popularization, other narratives of stigma would take over. And I want to deal with OO here because this is not a regrets debate, and I do not think destigmatization happened as a result of the popularization of Therapy Speak. Why? Firstly, prior to this popularization, which is fairly recent phenomenon, we had increasing medical knowledge and understanding of mental conditions. We understand contributing factors, i.e. brain chemistry, gene pools, biological heredity for specific conditions, and things like this. Secondly, increasing diagnoses of things like depression and autism has sparked a lot of awareness in the public conscious. Yossi says, when it's just in the academic sphere, nobody hears about it. But when autism rates rise, people have relatives who are diagnosed with these kinds of things. Friends, parents, and people see other people who have diagnoses. When depression is on the rise massively and you see visible signs of that among the body politic, more people are likely to be aware of that existence of those things, not passively neglecting it entirely. But thirdly, crucially, there are tons of other narratives that exist in status quo that say that people are legitimate for being different and have a right to cope with things differently. This is very popular when we look at things like the commercialization of self-care in popular media that says you are legitimate for coping with things in different mechanisms, and you are legitimate for having differences even if you don't want to put a label on it, or acceptance of different queer identities that say you are legitimate for being different even if you don't fall under a specific umbrella term. We think this is often cross-applied to things like this. But finally, doctors and so on are going to have incentives to reach out and make these things accessible to people through things like WebMD, through things like easily accessible online things like Google that can discuss these kinds of things. And people who actually have these conditions are still going to speak out on either side of the house. So I really don't think they get a large delta in terms of popularization. What happens in the absence of this popularization? I think narratives of destigmatization without labels would become significantly stronger. Why? Firstly, I think that insofar as I've already proven that a lot of acceptance has arisen for situations that each individual is unique and their own experience is something that is unique, more people are willing to accept that insofar as the popularization of things like your own truth in the media, through things like the Me Too movement have become quite prominent. But secondly, insofar as most people believe that you should not be prescriptive, i.e. my life is my life alone, you should not react to situations in a way that suits others rather than yourself, I think it's probably the case that narratives of destigmatization would emerge on either side of the house. But finally, even if they're winning on awareness very marginally, and I've given you significant reasons to cast doubt on that, I'm going to explain why the greater awareness is bad, because more information is not an inherent good if it comes at the expense of misinformation. First extension, how does popularization look and why can't it be nuanced? I want to characterize first how this popularization actually looks, because OG asserts it seeps into every vernacular, you see memes, and therefore you take things less seriously. I think it's far, far more structurally flawed. Why? Firstly, it looks like people on social media, you have claiming authority and claiming to be an authority on the matter. This looks like your favorite influencer, your smart cousin, people you already attribute a degree of trust to, like celebrities or influencers, speaking out about this kind of things. This is why in many cases you likely trust them and ascribe a unique authority to them, even if they're wrong. But secondly, the popularization, the degree to which medical services and mental health services are able to be accessed. Because note that the broad destigmatization toward mental health that we've proven is happening symmetrically, at least to an extent, creates incentives for doctors to reach more patients through easily accessible online forms, through utilizing social media, and through spreading awareness of conditions by like dedicating specific days to like Autism Day, for example, and things like this. And states have incentives to make these things accessible insofar as a more healthy mental population is better, and broadly increasing scientific knowledge happens on either side of the house. What popularization does is it dilutes the platforms for those experts significantly. But thirdly, popularization creates a race to the bottom, because the more popular these terms become, the more content creators, influencers, and celebrities have incentives to attribute symptoms of depression, i.e. overeating can be a symptom of many things. It might not be depression, but the most popular conditions, i.e. the ones that rise to the top in discourse, and you attribute a lot of different symptoms to the same cause. But fourthly, there's a trend towards homogenization, i.e. grouping different cases that sound like gaslighting, depression to one specific catch-all term, even though there are many, many other mental illnesses like borderline personality disorder, like various forms of mental instability that are very similar to depression, but very different in terms of the actual solutions to that kind of things. When you homogenize those things, it makes it harder for people to find the right solution. But finally, when these terms enter popular lexicon, they become single catch-all solutions that become common knowledge, i.e. people are more likely to be prescriptive about them to a significant degree, i.e. saying the right response to gaslighting is leaving your partner, the right response to depression is doing X rather than Y, when in reality, people have many different nuances and you need to talk to a medical professional about these kinds of things. What does this do to the debate? Firstly, this characterization already places us over OG, because OG is dependent on characterizing to unlock any of their impacts. They barely do this. They say popularization happens in a harmful way because it's memes, it's not nuanced. This is far better. But secondly, it also beats OO, because OO is relying on these terms being explained in a very, very nuanced way. I gave structural reasons why information doesn't translate in people's minds into a way that is reasonable. Rather, it homogenizes conditions, makes people think they have false solutions to their problems, and dilutes the quality of actual medical expertise getting to you. This is sufficient to win this debate, but now I'm going to explain why it robs people of coping mechanisms. Firstly, it increases the odds that everyone in your social circle believes your situation makes the criteria for a specific high-profile personality disorder or a specific term like gaslighting, which is high-profile, at the expense of others. This reduces the diversity and coping mechanisms you can turn to, because different friend groups and different people know you differently, but now the majority of people are likely to believe you have one very high-profile mental illness rather than a diversity or a spectrum of different ones. They're far more likely to counsel you with homogenized solutions because it's the one that's seeped into the popular culture, which you get far less diversity in solutions you attribute to. But secondly, when everyone's telling you the same thing, you have far more reduced coping mechanisms. When everyone labels you with one thing, even if you don't have that condition, it's really, really hard to think that you're ever going to hear actual solutions from people, because you know they're going to tell you, I'm just depressed. Everybody's told me that. I don't know I'm depressed. You preemptively opt out of asking for help, so you never get the empathy that Yossi wants you to get. Before I go on, opening up.
If you're correct that people have much greater understanding of mental health regardless, presumably that would have significantly more nuanced understanding also on social media. Either people have more understanding or they do not.
No, because the popularization necessarily crowds out the expertise that otherwise would reach them. And even if it's marginally less accessible, we get better quality information to more people. So we outweigh you and flip you. You're out of this debate. Why do we make it less likely that doctors and nurses and experts reach you? It's because of awareness. They now never connect with the people who need it the most because you'll preemptively self-select into the most popular diagnosis, believe they have that coping mechanism, and then move on with that. But finally, the popularization gives credence to people with the most social clout. So you look at the white girl who says, I deal with my depression by making a soy latte on Instagram, think that that's the solution, rather than embracing the actual solutions that would allow you to embrace nuances in your thing. This means the solutions you embrace are far worse and don't align with your personal background to a significantly greater degree. The comparative. How does this argument outweigh OG? Firstly, it outweighs OG by explaining why it is the case, regardless of the conditions, you're more likely to get access to nuanced and successful advice on our side of the house. But secondly, it explains why, in the absence of these kind of things, you preemptively self-select out of asking for help. So it's unlikely you ever get access. Finally, funding. It's honestly symmetrical. But the reason you get more of it on our side is because what happens is you create an informal third sector for these services. Quacks get paid for this kind of thing more, which means that doctors are getting less money, which means they're more underfunded significantly. This is the only actual delta in funding in this debate. Even though I spent only 10 seconds on it, it's still more important than anything Top Hat said. I'm incredibly proud to win from Closing Gov.
All right, we thank the member of GOV for that speech. We welcome the member of opposition to start the closing opposition case. Here.
Hi, before I begin, I would just like to say, Matt, please don't say you won from extension. We haven't even spoken yet. Beat us first and then win, bro. Anyway, POIs in the chat. I'll take one 530. I'll take one from OG. Okay, so starting in 3, 2, 1. So this is going to be a very simple CO. Firstly, unlike all that assert this, we're actually going to give you structural reasons as to why this narrative is good and counterbalanced. Thus, we will deal with majority of the prop harms because this, how do you say, it has accountability mechanisms on it. And secondly, we'll provide you a vertical extension about the premise that leader of opposition asserts, and he also tries to analyze the dialogue in the last minute about why information leads to good action within the greater society, etc. Let's get into the first premise. But before that, let's get into how the debate works so far. Marta's, in her speech, leader of ops, says, we live in a society where it is balanced and people understand that there is a specter, etc. There is no structural analysis on why this is the case. There is no likelihood analysis, and you cannot credit this if this is the case. But secondly, Matt in CG responds to this by saying this is not the case. This is in fact a toxic narrative, etc. We're going to provide you 3 reasons as to why this is not the case, and in fact, this narrative has counterbalance mechanisms in this sort of case. The first is that you'll have counter narrative that exists based on the misuse of this sort of thing. This counter narrative is likely to come based on the actual people who actually has these sort of types of diseases and sickness within them in these sorts of cases. Based on what OG said, this is so bad to them, this is so horrible, these people will most likely speak out. These people will most likely go to talk shows. These people will most likely be very loud, etc. Not these people both have incentive in terms of them communicating with each other, but also have ability. They can talk together in support groups and social media, etc. So firstly, they're likely to be listened to because they're likely to be vocal minority. So the focus is likely to be on them because they are or the receiving end of this sort of thing. But secondly, they're likely to be viewed as the ones who actually do dictate the norm in this sort of case, based on the analysis that these people, based on the analysis that society actually will listen to these sorts of people because they are, the real traumatized people in this sort of case. So this is the first reason. The second reason is that, the conversation will most likely exists around doctors in this sort of case. What do people do when they don't know the answer to something? They go to the expert, right? This is very intuitive thing. When this is talked about, when these terms are talked about, and there are debates, etc., most likely people will go to experts and experts will explain, this is how this looks like, this is in reality, what are these sorts of things. Not the norms existing and terminology existing and the debate happening is the precondition of these type of people gaining political capital, being invited in talk shows and actually talking about these sort of people. Note we have biases towards experts since we're kids, school teachers, doctors, etc. So wider society will most likely listen to these sort of things. So this is why it equals out. But thirdly, people have internalized stigma towards co-opting these type of things if they don't believe that this is the case. So here is how it goes. You most likely have lived in a society where before you obviously know there are mental sicknesses, right? So we have a very visceral image of what this is like to be the case, right? So you will personally feel bad, and this feeling, even though the normalization happens, most people still have these two narratives in their head. People are not stupid. You'll most likely feel bad if this is not the case. So this means this narrative will actually activate, and people will actually use this when they legitimately believe that this is the case, when they legitimately do this sort of thing, etc. And this type of thing. So this is why the narrative is balanced, and this deals with majority of the health harms in this sort of case. Before I get into our positive case, Matt says, but there will be normalization happening anyway. All of these reasons are Western reasons. This happening in the West where 300 million people exist. All of these reasons do not work in the developing world. All of these reasons do not work in Eastern Europe. So we would posit that it's better for this narrative to actually continue to existing, these words continue existing, so you're able to get this sort of thing. So normalization does not happen in the West of the world. Let's get into our extension. So what is the problem with all? Marta says, you're observing that something is common. Thus people get, educated about it, it will be normalized. Again, no analysis. The analysis or the attempt of analysis comes in the deputy leader of opposition. I'm going to be extremely technical here. The deputy leader of opposition says people have preconceived biases as to why they do not care about this issue, and then says this will somehow trigger empathy. They do not prove why this triggers empathy, right? So here is the analogy. Poor people exist in society, and people know about the harms of poor people. Are people necessarily empathetic towards people? No, you have other people who are not empathetic. So the question is, why specifically this being an illness will trigger the empathy in this sort of case? This is first thing that they will prove. I'll prove to you. There are three reasons why this will trigger it. Firstly, people consider sicknesses as arbitrary, as random. In many of these cases, that this is random sentence that's placed on you. So it's not something that you necessarily chose in these particular circumstances. So this is why people have an empathetic reaction towards you, because it will be the case. This is not true for, let's say, poverty, where there are counter analyses that say you choose to be poor, people are lazy, etc. Secondly, it's very visceral. Like people, have negative aspect of you being sick and these sorts of cases, of this being problematic, etc. But thirdly, you can associate with past experiences and past things that you have had in the past. You yourself were most likely sick, but other people around you are sick, like your family members, etc. So this is why information will trigger empathy. They do not prove this sort of thing. But second thing they don't prove is why information will lead to you, taking good actions in this sort of case. So here is where I'll expand this in this sort of thing. What do good actions look like? They look like two things. One, reading more on the topic, getting more educated, and two, basing your comments and your actions on this sort of thing. So you know that you're talking to a person with mental health issues to change your the way you talk and to change the behavior of this sort of thing. Before I continue with three more mechanisms, go.
The millions of people who already have illnesses but don't have the money to afford solution to this need the people around them to take them seriously. But at the point where they trivialize these mental illnesses, that urgency goes away.
I gave you three reasons as to why they don't trivialize them. There is a counter narrative. It is counterbalanced. You give no reasons. That's why we beat you. I will rebut you more. Mechanisms. Firstly, notice that people on balance are conformist, and there are structural reasons for why this is the case. Firstly, you want to choose the path of least resistance because this is easier, it's least cost to you, etc. But secondly, this is an evolution mechanism, right? People are conformist because that's an easy way for you to create societies, tribes, and these type of things. What does this mean? The only reason people are anti-mental health is because the narrative so far was mental health is not a real disease. But when the narrative changes to this is actually a problem, there are accessible terms in this sort of thing, most people will actually change their their minds because people will be conformists. They'll most likely become to what is the new trendy thing, what is the new acceptable thing. So when this is how you say a slick new thing that Zoomers talk about all the time, then people will just go, yeah, sure, that's the case. No, this is super important structural analysis that proves normalization. But secondly, there is usually a shock value when you see this sort of thing, right? You almost like go, what do you mean by ADHD? What is this sort of thing? So when this shock value comes, when someone literally ground breaks your conception, this is the moment when you want to learn more, right? This is the moment when you go on Wikipedia, you read more, you watch the interviews, so you try to get involved in this sort of case. But thirdly, there is likely to be a cancel culture created when people are not informed on these sort of cases. So most likely when celebrities speak out about this sort of thing and they speak out wrongly, people will cancel them, but also in conversations, people will be ridiculed if they don't necessarily know the right terminology, if they don't know this in a particular, if they're doing this badly. So this proves to you the link between information existing and actually people taking good actions, which leads to the overall benefits when we promote them. Protocols.
All right. We thank the member of opposition for that speech. We now welcome the government whip to conclude the CG case here.
Hi, am I audible? Matt, mute yourself. Okay, great. Can somebody say something so I can make sure that I can hear POIs?
I can hear you, Ahmed.
Great, that is audible. For POIs, please put them in the chat. Don't verbally interrupt me. Genuinely, don't verbally interrupt me unless I cut out randomly for some reason. Great. Just getting my notes sorted. Matt, can I use your timer? Shaya, stop fucking texting Matt. Okay, great. 3, 2, 1. Yossi asks a POI that is fair, which is if it's the case that destigmatization is happening symmetrically, why terms that? It sounds intuitive, but this is important. 1, Matt explains what is unique about the environments where these terms are used, i.e. the authority, the problems with TikTok, to happen in 15 seconds and necessarily simplify things. How social media influencers have overwhelming power over this narrative relative to people with other countervailing sets of authority that ought to be listened to more that are crowded out. Secondarily, Matt explains what is unique about these terms specifically that differentiates it from just popularization, i.e. they homogenize it. They create a race to the bottom in terms of sensationalizing mental health illnesses. All of this means that the narrative is one that is devoid of nuance and really, really bad. Matt explains and flips the OO and CO, and he said that this narrative short circuits the path to even get to access to therapy. Let's deal with CO now. Firstly, on their responses to us, they say there's a counter narrative by people who are sick. Or who have mental illnesses. One, note they have substantially less authority because you can't tell who is in fact the person that is or is not having a mental illness. But secondarily, people who don't have it have an inflated sense of authority to crowd out those because they believe their self-diagnosis is legitimate, and because it's invisible, you cannot tell who is correct and who is not. Secondarily, they say, but you can still go to experts on our side, which is the response to like the crowding out mechanism. There's no engagement for its experts, but secondarily, the info side literally says it's people partaking in speculative psychiatric diagnoses of others, including public figures. They cannot contradict the way this motion works. On their case then, firstly, the developing world. If this is now,
I think this is far less because of their ironically third mechanism. People are conformists, so they will listen to the public figure with social authority, but not the medical authority because there's low barriers of entry. Directly what is said in the member of op. Finally, on cancel culture. Note I already responded to this in their response to us on why the counter narrative by people who are sick. It's unlikely the counter narrative in cancel culture can even materialize because you don't know who has the authority. But on cancel culture, this mechanism doesn't work. It's quite ineffective insofar as you don't know who to believe. You don't know, like there's also a counterculture to the counterculture of cancel culture and people saying cancel culture is stupid. But cancellation also just means that celebs will default to commonly held truisms at the expense of offering real advice. They will instead just offer the least helpful, least in-depth stuff. So their best case is the cancellation thing mitigates their own benefit. Is good. They assume that the common prescriptive solution to gaslighting is something that suits you when it otherwise not, i.e. they give you a medication for an issue that you might not have. It is better, even if you do not get a prescriptive solution, that it is not one that is for a different illness that might make it actually worse. On a whole, their case is normalization means there's less of a reason to stigma and create more fun and a lot of good benefits. They need to explain why therapy speak is the mechanism for raising awareness for mental health issues and empathy. Here is why this isn't the reason for the stigma going down, and it's likely without therapy speak, there would still largely be awareness of mental health. Once, literally studies outside of therapy speak, the fact that almost every teen has depression, rising rates of suicide, i.e. people are aware that people are suffering even without the use of this particular terminology, and the media picks it up because it's a large social phenomenon that is proven by data outside of this speak. Secondarily, a desire for entertainment and media to increase the representation of marginalized groups as a whole and create new stories. Thirdly, the fact that the disability movement since the 60s before this phenomenon is largely pushing for these kinds of things. Fourthly, the fact that doctors' accessibility to social media and large platforms to raise awareness, i.e. them getting TikTok and etc., telling you to get tested or diagnosed, but we shouldn't crowd those avenues out. Or fifthly, the advancements in the academic field that trickle down to everyone, i.e. schools getting better guidance counselors because they have better training from the academic studies that mean you get better testing to see what issues people have. Or sixthly, finally, the accessibility of social media allows many of the people who are diagnosed to share their story and build empathy and say they're just like everyone else. They just need different kinds of help, but now they have more authority because you don't crowd out the people who misinform. The upshot, their whole case and impacts rely on this phenomenon being directly responsible or a tipping point, but never explain why therapy speak, which is what the motion is about, would outweigh anything else that I just listed for you. Now, when you normalize, I think the people who actually have it are seen as the new extreme, i.e. they aren't like the normal ADHD that everyone has. They're super, super weird now. It's actually seen as even more inherent to you because they're behaving contradictory to what people expect. Secondarily, they say, there's far worse and derogatory terms for people who do have ADHD. Why don't people just literally say, I have ADHD if somebody calls them weird? They never explain why people who actually have it don't have that capacity to utilize an understanding of mental health that has been rising. If you have a mental illness, maybe you don't want people to know and would prefer they call you aloof instead of sick in the head. POI, quick.
I'm more likely to reach out for expert advice on ADHD when I hear the term being used commonly and with understanding. On your side of the house, I hear it being used only very rarely and for most extreme examples, and I'm less likely to reach out for advice.
I think you are more likely to reach out for ADHD when there's a rising awareness that mental health is something that matters and you ought to get tested. I have ADHD and their solution is I make a fucking coffee latte in the morning to deal with my depression, and now you think you've solved it. That's why you get less of that and less better responses. Finally, for the people that don't have it, they deflect accountability and use it as an excuse for bad behavior. I am abusive because I'm depressed now and I can self-diagnose. This decreases empathy, if anything, because now shitty people make the whole group of them now look as if there is something inherently wrong with them. Why do we beat OG very clearly? Aside from the reasons that Matt gave you, their case is reliant on an idea that people cannot differentiate the scale of suffering. They never explain why people cannot differentiate the scale, which OO very fairly points out against OG. I'm not saying any of OG is wrong, but they never answer the central question from up. Matt explains it by explaining how the process of popularization means that you, by definition, have to not be able to differentiate the scale because you crowd out doctors, you create a race to the bottom. That is the linchpin for their case to actually work. But even if you don't buy that, his second extension outweighs for the reason that he gave that I don't need to repeat. Now that Rumen has gone, very proud to win from CG.
Yeah. Bro, Ahmed, Matt, good job. But you seem to be forgetting one final aspect of the whole winning from CG thing. Come on, give me the phone.
Sorry.
Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. I'm going to do two very basic things. Firstly, I'm going to engage with opening half and explain why we the fact to take opening opposition and why our reasons are their case is contingent on this. Then I'm going to engage with closing opposition. Firstly, and I want to note that a deadlock exists in opening up, because if the perception of these narratives is bad, then opening government are correct, and people have bad perceptions of them, and this leads to people who actually do have these illnesses to not be understood, to not be reacted in this sort of way. Or if opening opposition are right, that they are good, then opening government do not get their impacts of people misunderstand these illnesses. Opening opposition do get their impacts of people understand these illnesses comparatively more. But note, they all don't get those impacts if they don't prove that these illnesses will be perceived accurately and that these terms will describe these illnesses accurately. Because it doesn't matter if people now know more about ADHD if they have a wrong understanding of what ADHD is. Because then this means that the positive action they'll take is not towards people who deserve it in this sort of way. They give no structural reasoning for why this will be presented in a good way. All they say is there is a nuance, there is a scale. Why is there a nuance? Why is there a scale? We say that, how do you say, that if this is presented badly in this sort of way, then we can counter it. There are experts who can say it in this sort of way. Oh, they said, oh, but there is a scale, but they never analyze why there is a scale, why there is a degree of nuance. Insofar as all of their benefits are contingent on this one piece of analysis, then it works. I want to note here, even if you accept that closing government rebuts our reasons and we don't have reasons, it doesn't matter because we gave reasons. Top half did not give reasons, and therefore even these sorts of reasons, insofar as top half is entirely contingent on this one sort of piece of analysis, we should be able to take it even if we hypothetically lose to closing government. But the second important piece of extension is, and I want to flag what opening opposition's case is, because opening opposition's cases, you will know more. And I think they prove this to some extent. You get more information on it. But they never prove why knowing that little Marta has ADHD means you will stop bullying little Marta in this sort of way. All they say is, oh, but you get empathy. Why don't you get empathy for little Marta anyways? The only thing that changes is a difference of how you label little Marta. They needed to prove that the difference in labeling in related to knowledge is the thing that is contingent on outcomes. Here is how we prove this, because now you associate it with illness, because now it is a mental illness. It's not just someone being weird. And then all of Roman's asymmetrical reasons on why you consider illness to be something much more important, and I have empathy for specifically those people kick in. They do not have the reason why this change of name leads to this. But also secondly, because this now creates the sort of phenomenon that people have mental illness, that you have to respect mental illness. Insofar as people, for the most part, how do you say, conformist, then this now means that they're like to, how do you say, be nicer, that they're not going to bully, that they're going to lead to the sort of positive actions they're talking about in this sort of way. All this says, you know, so you'll be good. They never explain why on the counterfactual you're not going to be good. We explain that you don't have empathy for everyone, but you have empathy for a particular kind of people. We now allow Marta to be that particular kind of people. Final thing I want to outweigh. They say, more people are going to go to the therapist and they're going to realize if they themselves have therapy. This is to me a very questionable clash on the simple basis that if people are really suffering, there are massive symmetrical incentives to go to the doctor anyways. Maybe there is a difference, sure, but they never prove why this is the major tipping point in this sort of way. We don't base our case on this. What we say is this changes how people act towards you, and how people perceive you and act towards you is much more fluid based on the sort of language that is used in this sort of way. So this is the only benefit that is not contingent on the analysis we give. We outweigh it, therefore we should take top half. Now on to closing government. Firstly, they say awareness is symmetrical. All of their reasons for why this is the case is West-centric. There has not been big research about mental illness over here. Nobody knows shit. A lot of these things have not come in. We don't have competent doctors and all of these sorts of ways. But you know what we do have? We have movies, we have the TV show, we have all of these sorts of things. We have the tiki-toki in this way. And then language comes in comparatively far easier than anything else can come in, right? You will not be able to get all of these sorts of things, but if there is a change
people using it, when you see it on the movies, then in those contexts where there is the least destigmatization, then you get massive in this sort of way. Also, second, let's accept there are symmetrical reasons for destigmatization. This is a very vulnerable group. An extra reason for destigmatization looks pretty important to me in this sort of way. If it relates to how people treat these people, what kind of benefits they give them, I still do not see why there being other reasons why this happens. Doesn't mean that our thing is not so important. Now, on to their rebuttals to us, or rather, firstly, I'll rebut their. Actually, before this even, I want to do the weighing. Even if you accept all of their rebuttals, we get all of our impacts, right? And not so many people change the way they treat people with mental illness. People potentially feel bad about these sorts of things. Know that ours is a much more concrete impact because you don't know how people feel, especially with mental illness. You don't know how different things affect them. You don't know all of these sorts of things, but you know that people treating them nicely is a good thing to them. Did not give this weighing. We are the first one to give this weighing in this sort of way. But then, rebuttal to them. Firstly, they say, you will not listen to the authority figures because you cannot tell who has authority and because they'll crowd out the others. Before I go on, opening government.
All proves that everyone debates who to believe regarding this. We show that the existence of the debate means people don't think they need professionals and they already understand it. That takes away the urgency you require to care for someone.
No. If you get a doctor who says, no, this is not mental illness. Here is what mental illness is. And these people get a symmetrical platform because of our thing, because of this change of language, because of this comparative attention, then no. People do not just have wrong perceptions that they understand it in this sort of way. But now I want to get the closing opposition because they say it's hard to tell who is actually the expert. It's very easy to tell who is the expert. Spoiler alert, doctors are the expert. It's usually easy to tell who is a doctor in this sort of way. But also, secondly, when people have actually suffered, if they share details about their story, if they explain this sort of thing, then you can tell who is real and who is not real in this sort of way. And this is very important to know. You will listen to the experts, not to the other ones, because there is a comparative greater perception that these people are the experts. When you have questions, you do not turn to a random influencer, you turn to people who you perceive have comparatively more knowledge than this. But secondly, they say, there is incentive to homogenize the sort of thing. I want to say two things. There is actually, I want to say the basic thing. There is not true. There is incentive to diversify different terms to describe different experiences. Why? Because one, many people simply want to feel different. They want to push that their experience is not identical to other people. They want to create nuances in their own experience in comparison to the experience of other people. But also, secondly, there are people who are quality, who understand this stuff, who tell you, no, there is no homogeneous in this sort of way. We prove why you listen to those people. This should be proud to win from closing opposition voters.
We thank the opposition for that speech. And that brings us now to the end of the round. Cross house, shake hands. And yeah, thank you so much. Thankfully for us, this is a blind round, sadly for you. And yeah, the best of luck in your future rounds. Feel free to